The temperature was negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit when Dr. Sarah Chen made the decision that would either save her career or end her life. Standing at the edge of the Greenland ice sheet with nothing but an emergency pack and her years of glaciology training, she faced a choice no scientist should ever have to make. Behind her, the research station burned in the Arctic night, taking with it 3 months of climate data that could change how the world understood global warming. Ahead of her stretched 200 miles of some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. What happened next would transform a quiet university researcher into one of the most feared and respected expedition leaders in polar science. But the woman who walked into that frozen wasteland alone was not the same person who would emerge 6 days later, frostbitten and forever changed, carrying secrets that would launch the most controversial Arctic mission of the 21st century. This is the true story of how one woman's desperate journey across the ice became the foundation for an operation so ruthless and effective that it would redefine Arctic research forever. It begins with a fire, a choice, and a walk into the kind of cold that kills within hours. It ends with a mission that would push the boundaries of human endurance and scientific ethics to their absolute limits. Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that the ice would kill her someday. She just never imagined it would happen on a Tuesday. The Greenland Research Station Alpha had been her home for 3 months. A collection of prefabricated modules connected by heated tunnels and held together by determination and hope. Located 200 miles from the nearest settlement, it was one of the most isolated scientific outposts on the planet. Sarah had volunteered for the assignment because she needed the data, and because running away to the end of the world seemed like the only way to escape the scandal that had destroyed her reputation back at Stanford University. The fire started in the main laboratory at 11:47 p.m. local time. Sarah was in her quarters, reviewing temperature readings from the ice core samples they had extracted that morning, when the emergency alarm began its harsh mechanical scream. She grabbed her parka and rushed through the connecting tunnel, but even before she reached the lab, she could smell the acrid smoke and feel the heat pressing against the reinforced walls. The sight that greeted her was every researcher's nightmare. Flames were consuming the main server room, where 3 months of climate data was stored on drives that represented years of work and millions of dollars in funding. The fire suppression system had failed, and her 2 colleagues, Dr. James Morrison and Dr. Lisa Park, were frantically trying to save what they could while fighting back the smoke that filled the air with toxic fumes. The backup drives, Sarah shouted over the roar of the flames. "We need to get to the backup drives." But James was already shaking his head, his face streaked with soot and desperation. The fire started there. "Everything is gone, Sarah. 3 months of temperature data, ice composition analysis, atmospheric readings. All of it." Lisa stumbled out of the smoke, coughing violently. "We need to evacuate. The fuel storage is right next to the lab. If this fire reaches those tanks..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what would happen if the fire reached the heating fuel. The explosion would not only destroy the station but also eliminate any chance of rescue for weeks. The nearest help was a helicopter flight away, and in this weather no pilot would risk the journey until the storm passed. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, watching years of work disappear into flames and smoke. The data they were losing wasn't just numbers on a computer screen. It was evidence of accelerated ice melt that could change global climate models. It was proof that the Greenland ice sheet was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. Without this data, her research would be meaningless, and her career, already hanging by a thread after the plagiarism accusations at Stanford, would be finished forever. That's when she remembered the emergency cache. 2 weeks earlier, following standard protocol, Sarah had created a backup of the most critical data and stored it in the emergency shelter located 5 miles from the main station. It was supposed to be a safety measure, a last resort in case of exactly this kind of disaster. But reaching the emergency shelter meant traveling across 5 miles of ice in conditions that could kill an experienced polar explorer, let alone a university scientist who had spent most of her career in temperature-controlled laboratories. "The emergency cache," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the chaos around them. James looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Sarah, no. You can't be serious. It's nearly 50 below out there, and there's a storm coming in. Even if you could reach the shelter, how would you get back?" But Sarah was already moving, her mind calculating distances and survival odds with the cold precision that had made her one of the most respected glaciologists of her generation before everything went wrong. The emergency shelter contained not only the backup drives but also food, fuel, and a communication system that could reach the outside world. More importantly, it contained a snowmobile that could get her to the helicopter landing zone 60 miles south. The evacuation helicopter won't be here for at least 18 hours, she said, pulling on her Arctic gear with practiced efficiency. By then, everything will be gone. This is the only chance to save the data. Lisa grabbed her arm. Sarah, listen to yourself. You're talking about crossing the ice alone, at night, in the worst weather we've seen all season. No one survives that kind of exposure. No one. But Sarah was already checking her emergency pack, inventorying the supplies that would mean the difference between life and death in the Arctic wilderness. Emergency rations for 3 days, a sleeping bag rated to 60 below, flares, a GPS device, and a satellite phone with enough battery for 1 call. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The truth was, Sarah Chen had nothing left to lose. Her career was in ruins, her reputation destroyed by accusations she couldn't disprove, and her research dismissed by colleagues who had once respected her work. This data was her chance at redemption, her opportunity to prove that her theories about accelerated climate change were correct. Without it, she would return to Stanford as a failed scientist whose career had ended in fire and scandal. I'm not asking for permission, she said quietly, adjusting the straps on her pack and checking the battery on her GPS device. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The wind hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside the station. The temperature gauge on her jacket read -47 degrees. And the wind chill pushed the effective temperature down to nearly 70 below. At that temperature, exposed skin would freeze in less than 5 minutes, and hypothermia could set in within 30 minutes even with proper protection. Behind her, she could hear James and Lisa shouting her name, but their voices were already being swallowed by the wind in the distance. Ahead of her stretched an endless expanse of ice and snow, illuminated only by the faint glow of her headlamp and the occasional flash of aurora in the sky above. The first mile was the hardest. Sarah's body fought against every step, her muscles stiffening in the cold despite the layers of insulation she wore. The snow was deeper than she had expected, sometimes rising to her waist, forcing her to fight for every yard of progress. Her breathing created ice crystals that formed on the inside of her face mask, making each breath more difficult than the last. But she kept walking. One step, then another, guided by the glowing dot on her GPS screen and the certainty that stopping meant death. The emergency shelter was a small dot in an endless wilderness, but it was her destination, her salvation, and her only chance to salvage something from the disaster that was consuming her life's work. By the second mile, the cold had penetrated even her Arctic gear. She could feel the first signs of frostbite in her toes, a tingling numbness that she knew would progress to serious tissue damage if she didn't reach shelter soon. The wind was getting stronger, driving snow and ice particles that stung her exposed face like needles and made it increasingly difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. The GPS signal began to weaken during the 3rd mile, the satellite connection interrupted by the storm clouds above. Sarah found herself navigating by compass and instinct, following the landmarks she had memorized during her months at the station. A distinctive rock formation here, a small ridge there. Natural features that remained constant even when everything else was buried under snow. Halfway through the 4th mile, she fell through the ice. The crack appeared without warning, a thin line in what had seemed like solid ground. One moment Sarah was walking confidently across what appeared to be firm ice, and the next she was plunging through the surface into water so cold it felt like liquid fire against her skin. The shock of the immersion drove the air from her lungs, and for a terrifying moment she thought she would drown under the ice. Another casualty of the Arctic wilderness that had claimed so many before her. But her training kicked in. Years of safety courses and emergency preparation took over where panic might have paralyzed her. She forced herself to remain calm, to breathe slowly, to use her ice picks to pull herself out of the water and onto solid ground. Her clothes were soaked, and she knew that wet clothing in these temperatures meant almost certain death unless she could find shelter immediately. The emergency protocol she had memorized years earlier became her lifeline. Strip off the wet clothing. Use the emergency blanket from her pack to insulate against the ground. Put on the spare dry clothes she carried for exactly this situation. Work quickly but methodically because panic would kill her as surely as the cold. She changed clothes in the middle of the Arctic wilderness, her hands so numb she could barely work the zippers and buttons, but determination driving her forward. The wet clothes would freeze solid within minutes, but the dry clothing would give her enough time to reach the shelter if she moved quickly. The 5th mile was a blur of pain and determination. Sarah's body was shutting down, conserving heat for her vital organs and abandoning her extremities to the cold. She could no longer feel her feet, and her hands were clumsy and unresponsive despite the insulated gloves. But she could see the shelter now. a small dark shape against the white landscape, close enough that even her failing vision could make out its outline. She reached the emergency shelter at 4:23 a.m., nearly 5 hours after leaving the burning research station. Her key card wouldn't work at first, the electronic lock frozen by the cold. But eventually the door opened and she stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, as warmth began to seep back into her body. The shelter was exactly as she remembered it. A small but efficient space with heating, communication equipment, food supplies, and most importantly, the backup drives that contained 3 months of critical climate data. But as Sarah sat on the floor, slowly regaining feeling in her hands and feet, she realized that surviving the journey was only the first part of her challenge. The real test would be what happened next. The communication system would allow her to contact the outside world, but it would also mean revealing what she had discovered in the data, information that would change everything the scientific community believed about climate change and Arctic ice melt. The research she had been conducting in secret, the theories that had led to her downfall at Stanford, were all confirmed by the evidence stored on these drives. But presenting this data would mean fighting a battle against established scientific opinion, government interests, and corporate lobbying that made her journey across the ice seem simple by comparison. It would mean becoming the leader of a research mission so controversial and aggressive that it would earn her a reputation for ruthlessness that would follow her for the rest of her career. As she activated the communication system and prepared to make contact with the rescue team, Sarah Chen made a decision that would transform her from a disgraced university researcher into one of the most feared and respected figures in polar science. She would not simply present her data and hope for the best. She would use it as a weapon, a tool, to force the scientific community to confront the truth about climate change, regardless of who got hurt in the process. The woman who had walked alone into the ice was about to become the leader of the most ruthless Arctic mission ever attempted. And it would all begin with a single phone call from an emergency shelter in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet, where the temperature was still falling, and the storm was just beginning to reach its full fury. The rescue helicopter found Sarah Chen 6 days later, huddled in the emergency shelter with frostbite on 3 toes, and a story that would change everything anyone thought they knew about Arctic survival and scientific determination. But the woman they lifted from that frozen outpost was not the same person who had walked into the ice nearly a week earlier. Captain Mike Rodriguez, a veteran pilot who had been flying Arctic rescue missions for 15 years, later said that he had never seen anyone emerge from that kind of ordeal with their mind not only intact but sharper than before. Most people who survive something like that, they're broken, he remembered, traumatized. Sarah Chen looked like she had been forged by the ice, like she had found something out there that made her stronger instead of weaker. What Rodriguez couldn't have known was that during her 6 days in the emergency shelter, Sarah had done more than simply survive. He had analyzed every piece of data on the backup drives, cross-referenced it with atmospheric readings from weather stations across Greenland, and discovered something that would fundamentally change how the world understood climate change. The ice wasn't just melting faster than predicted, it was melting in patterns that suggested the entire Greenland ice sheet could collapse within decades, not centuries. The implications were staggering. Sea levels would rise not by inches over generations, but by feet within years. Coastal cities would disappear. Millions of people would become climate refugees. The global economy would collapse under the weight of unprecedented environmental disaster. But Sarah had also discovered something else during her analysis. The data showed clear evidence that certain government agencies and corporate interests had been suppressing similar research for years. The temperature readings, ice core samples, and atmospheric data all pointed to a systematic cover-up of climate information that could have prevented the crisis if it had been made public earlier. As the helicopter carried her back to civilization, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would not simply publish her findings in a scientific journal where they could be buried by peer-review politics and corporate influence. She would weaponize the data, use it to build a research mission so aggressive and uncompromising that it would force the truth into the open, regardless of who tried to stop it. Her first move came 3 weeks later, during what was supposed to be a quiet debriefing session at Stanford University. The conference room was filled with department heads, university administrators, and representatives from the National Science Foundation, who had funded the original Greenland expedition. They expected a routine presentation about equipment failures and lessons learned from the station fire. Instead, Sarah walked into the room carrying a laptop containing enough evidence to destroy careers and topple research programs that had been built on decades of compromised data. She connected the laptop to the projection screen and began what would later be called the Stanford Ultimatum. The Greenland ice sheet will completely collapse within 37 years, she announced without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had literally walked through hell to obtain the data she was presenting. Sea levels will rise by 14 feet globally, displacing approximately 200 million people and submerging major coastal cities including Miami, New Orleans, and large portions of Manhattan. The room erupted in protests and questions, but Sarah continued speaking over the noise. More importantly, evidence shows that this timeline has been known to government agencies and corporate research divisions for at least 8 years. The data has been systematically suppressed through funding cuts, research restrictions, and academic pressure designed to prevent these findings from reaching the public. Elizabeth Warren, the department head who had originally censured Sarah for her controversial climate theories, stood up from her seat. "Dr. Chen, these are extremely serious accusations. Do you have proof to support these claims?" Sarah smiled for the first time since returning from Greenland.
I have 3 months of temperature data, ice core analysis, and atmospheric readings that have never been compromised by political or corporate influence. I also have communication records, funding documents, and research directives that show a clear pattern of data suppression dating back nearly a decade.
She clicked to the next slide, revealing a list of names, dates, and dollar amounts that represented the scope of the cover-up, government officials who had buried inconvenient research reports, corporate executives who had funded studies designed to produce predetermined results, academic administrators who had destroyed careers to protect political relationships. "This is what I'm going to do," Sarah continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "I'm going to return to the Arctic with a team of researchers who share my commitment to scientific truth over political convenience. We're going to conduct the most comprehensive climate study ever attempted, and we're going to publish every finding in real time, with live data feeds that cannot be altered or suppressed." The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone present understood what Sarah was proposing. It wasn't just a research mission. It was a direct assault on the established scientific and political order that had kept climate data hidden from the public for years. Dr. Warren was the first to speak. "The university cannot support this kind of mission. The liability alone would be enormous, and the political ramifications. The university doesn't have a choice," Sarah interrupted, clicking to a new slide that showed detailed financial records.
"According to the funding agreements for the original Greenland expedition, I retain full rights to any data collected during the mission."
That includes the backup data I retrieved from the emergency shelter. I can publish these findings independently, or I can do it with Stanford's support. Either way, the truth is going public. What happened next would be remembered as the moment Dr. Sarah Chen transformed from a disgraced researcher into one of the most powerful figures in climate science. She presented the university administration with what amounted to an ultimatum: support her new Arctic mission, or she would release the evidence of data suppression in a way that would destroy Stanford's reputation and eliminate millions of dollars in government funding. The administrators tried to call her bluff, but Sarah had spent 6 days in an Arctic shelter planning for exactly this moment. Within hours of leaving the meeting, she had contacted investigative journalists at major newspapers, sharing selected portions of her data along with evidence of the systematic cover-up. By the end of the week, front-page stories were running in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Guardian, all citing anonymous sources within the climate research community who confirmed Sarah's allegations. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Climate activists held protests at universities across the country, demanding the release of suppressed research data. Congressional hearings were announced to investigate government agencies that had been accused of hiding climate information. Corporate stock prices plummeted as investors realized the true scope of the climate crisis. But Sarah wasn't finished. The media attention and public pressure were just the first phase of her plan. The real work would begin when she returned to the Arctic with a hand-picked team of researchers who shared her commitment to aggressive, uncompromising scientific investigation. Building that team required a different kind of ruthlessness. Sarah couldn't simply recruit established researchers who might be compromised by existing political and corporate relationships. She needed scientists who had been marginalized by the academic establishment, researchers whose careers had been damaged because they had refused to compromise their principles. Dr. Marcus Johnson was her first recruit, a former NASA climatologist who had been forced out of his position after publishing papers that contradicted official agency positions on climate change. His expertise in satellite data analysis would be crucial for the mission Sarah was planning. Dr. Elena Vasquez came next, an oceanographer from UC San Diego who had been denied tenure after her research on ocean temperature changes produced results that threatened lucrative contracts with oil companies. Her knowledge of Arctic Ocean systems would be essential for understanding the full scope of ice sheet collapse. The third member of her core team was Dr. James Morrison, her former colleague from the original Greenland mission, who had witnessed the station fire. Despite offers from other universities, he chose to follow Sarah into what many in the scientific community were calling career suicide. Together, they began planning what would become known as the Greenland Truth Mission, an expedition that would push the boundaries of Arctic research in ways that had never been attempted.
They would establish multiple research stations across the ice sheet, collect data in real time with live satellite transmission to prevent any possibility of suppression, and conduct their research with a level of transparency that would make it impossible for political or corporate interests to interfere with their findings. But the mission would require funding, equipment, and logistical support that traditional scientific institutions were unwilling to provide.
The research Sarah was proposing was too controversial, too politically sensitive, and too threatening to established interest for any government agency or university to officially endorse. That's when Sarah made the decision that would earn her a reputation for ruthlessness that would follow her for the rest of her career. If the scientific establishment wouldn't support her mission, she would build her own establishment. She would create a research organization that operated outside traditional academic and political constraints, funded by sources that had no interest in suppressing climate data.
The Climate Truth Foundation was established 6 months after Sarah's return from Greenland, funded by a coalition of environmental groups, concerned billionaires, and foreign governments that wanted access to unfiltered climate data. The foundation operated with complete transparency, publishing all financial records and research findings in real time on a website that became one of the most visited scientific resources on the internet.
More importantly, the foundation was designed to be immune to the political and corporate pressure that had compromised traditional climate research for decades. All research was conducted under international oversight, with data stored in multiple countries to prevent government seizure. Legal structures were established to protect researchers from academic and political retaliation. Sarah's transformation from university researcher to foundation director required her to develop skills that had nothing to do with glaciology or climate science. She learned to negotiate with hostile government officials, manage complex international logistics, and build research teams that could operate in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to be ruthless in pursuit of scientific truth. When corporate lawyers tried to suppress foundation research through legal challenges, Sarah fought back with lawsuits that exposed the company's own internal climate data. When government agencies attempted to restrict access to Arctic research areas, she used international law and diplomatic pressure to force compliance. The scientific community was divided in its response to Sarah's new role. Some researchers praised her for breaking free from the constraints that had prevented honest climate research for years. Others condemned her methods as unnecessarily aggressive and potentially damaging to the reputation of climate science as a whole. But Sarah had learned something during her 6 days alone in the Arctic shelter that her critics didn't understand. The climate crisis was too urgent, and the political resistance too strong for traditional academic approaches to be effective. The time for polite, scientific debate had passed. What was needed now was the kind of aggressive, uncompromising research that could force the truth into the open, regardless of who tried to stop it. As she prepared to return to the Arctic with her team, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since the night she walked alone into the ice. She had begun that journey as a disgraced researcher desperate to save her career. She was ending it as the leader of an organization that would fundamentally change how climate research was conducted and how scientific truth was protected from political interference. The woman who returned from Greenland was not just a survivor. She was a revolutionary who had learned to weaponize science in the service of truth, and she was about to lead the most controversial Arctic mission ever attempted. The Greenland Truth Mission launched on March 15th, exactly 1 year after Sarah Chen's solitary walk into the ice. But the expedition that departed from Reykjavik bore no resemblance to the quiet university research project that had been destroyed by fire and politics 12 months earlier. This was something entirely new in the world of climate science, a fully militarized research operation designed to collect and protect data at any cost. The team Sarah had assembled was unlike anything the scientific community had ever seen. 27 researchers, technicians, and support staff, many of whom had been blacklisted from traditional academic positions because of their unwillingness to compromise their scientific principles. They were led by Dr. Sarah Chen, but she was no longer the quiet university researcher who had first traveled to Greenland seeking redemption. She had become something harder, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who tried to interfere with her mission. The expedition's base camp was established at the same coordinates where Research Station Alpha had burned a year earlier, but the resemblance ended there. Instead of the modest collection of prefabricated modules that had housed the original mission, Sarah's team had constructed a fortress of science and technology that could resist both the Arctic environment and human interference. The main research facility was built into the ice itself, with laboratories, living quarters, and equipment storage areas carved directly into the glacier. Satellite communication systems provided real-time data transmission to servers located in 7 different countries, making it impossible for any single government to suppress the research findings. Solar panels and wind generators provided independent power, eliminating reliance on fuel supplies that could be interrupted by hostile authorities. But the most significant difference was the mission's approach to security and data protection. Sarah had learned from her experience with the original expedition that scientific research in the modern world required more than just good intentions and proper equipment. It required the ability to defend against corporate espionage, government interference, and political sabotage. The security measures Sarah implemented were unprecedented in civilian scientific research. The team included former military personnel trained in cold weather operations and electronic surveillance. Communication systems were encrypted using military-grade technology. Research data was transmitted through secure channels that had been established with the help of international intelligence agencies that had their own reasons for wanting accurate climate information. These precautions proved necessary almost immediately. Within 2 weeks of establishing the base camp, Sarah's team detected the first attempts at electronic surveillance of their communications. Corporate security firms hired by oil companies were trying to intercept research data before it could be transmitted to the outside world. Government agencies were monitoring satellite communications, looking for information that could be classified or suppressed for national security reasons. Sarah's response was swift and uncompromising.
Using legal resources provided by the Climate Truth Foundation, she filed lawsuits against the companies conducting surveillance operations, demanding millions of dollars in damages and court orders preventing further interference with scientific research. More importantly, she began releasing selected research findings in real time through social media and news organizations, making it impossible to suppress the data without also suppressing the entire internet.
The results of the mission's first month of research were devastating to established climate science predictions. Sarah's team confirmed that the Greenland ice sheet was melting at rates that exceeded even the most aggressive previous estimates. The data showed that complete collapse of the ice sheet was not only possible but inevitable within decades rather than centuries. But the team also discovered something that was even more disturbing than the accelerated melting rates. Hidden beneath layers of ice that had been stable for thousands of years, they found evidence of previous rapid climate changes that had occurred within human timescales. The ice cores showed that the Earth's climate system could shift from stable to catastrophic conditions within periods as short as 10 to 15 years. This finding contradicted decades of climate modeling that assumed gradual changes over long time periods. It suggested that the world could face complete environmental collapse much more quickly than anyone had anticipated, with consequences that would make current climate predictions seem optimistic by comparison. Sarah knew that releasing this information would trigger a global panic that could destabilize governments and crash economic systems around the world. But she also knew that suppressing it would guarantee the catastrophic outcomes the data predicted. The choice she faced was between causing immediate disruption or enabling future disaster. She chose disruption. The release of the accelerated timeline data came during a carefully orchestrated media campaign that Sarah had been planning since the mission began. Rather than simply publishing the findings in scientific journals where they could be ignored or discredited, she presented them simultaneously to major news organizations around the world, accompanied by video evidence from the ice cores and real-time temperature data that made the results impossible to dispute. The global response was immediate and overwhelming. Stock markets crashed as investors realized that entire industries would become obsolete within decades. Coastal real estate values plummeted as people began to understand that their properties would soon be underwater. Climate refugees began appearing at international borders as people in vulnerable areas started abandoning their homes years before the predicted disasters would arrive. But the most significant response came from the governments and corporations that had been suppressing climate data for decades. They launched a coordinated campaign to discredit Sarah's research, questioning her methods, her motives, and her sanity. Corporate lawyers filed lawsuits designed to tie up the Climate Truth Foundation in legal proceedings that could last for years. Government officials began investigating the foundation's funding sources, looking for any excuse to shut down the mission. Sarah's response revealed just how much she had changed during her transformation from university researcher to revolutionary scientist. Instead of defending herself against the attack, she went on the offensive, using the resources and connections she had built through the Climate Truth Foundation to launch a comprehensive assault on the institutions that had been hiding the truth about climate change. The foundation released decades of internal corporate documents that showed oil companies had known about accelerated climate change since the 1980s but had chosen to fund disinformation campaigns instead of taking action.
Government emails were leaked showing that federal agencies had been ordered to suppress climate research that contradicted official policy positions. University records were published demonstrating how academic careers had been destroyed to protect political relationships.
The revelations destroyed careers, toppled government officials, and bankrupted companies that had built their business models on climate denial and data suppression. But they also established Sarah Chen as one of the most feared figures in the intersection of science and politics, someone who would stop at nothing to protect scientific truth from those who wanted to suppress it. The ruthlessness that earned Sarah this reputation was most clearly demonstrated during what became known as the Exxon incident. When the oil giant attempted to use legal challenges to prevent the Climate Truth Foundation from accessing certain Arctic research areas, Sarah responded by releasing internal company documents showing that Exxon executives had known about the accelerated melting timeline for years but had continued to invest billions in Arctic drilling operations. The document release was timed to coincide with Exxon's annual shareholder meeting, creating maximum media attention and financial damage. But Sarah didn't stop there. She also arranged for Greenland government officials to revoke Exxon's drilling permits in Arctic waters, citing the company's deliberate concealment of environmental risks.
The combined legal, financial, and regulatory pressure forced Exxon to abandon its entire Arctic drilling program at a cost of over $8 billion. The message to other companies and government agencies was clear. Any attempt to interfere with climate research would result in immediate and devastating retaliation using every legal, political, and public relations tool at Sarah's disposal.
This approach earned Sarah both admirers and enemies throughout the scientific and political communities. Environmental activists praised her for breaking the power of corporate climate denial. Government officials condemned her methods as dangerous to national security and international stability. Academic researchers were divided between those who admired her effectiveness and those who worried that her aggressive tactics would damage the reputation of climate science as a whole. But Sarah had learned something during her year of transformation that her critics didn't understand. The climate crisis was too urgent and the political resistance too entrenched for traditional academic approaches to be effective. The time for polite scientific discourse had passed. What was needed was the kind of aggressive, uncompromising research that could force action regardless of political or economic consequences. The success of this approach became clear during the mission's final months in Greenland. Despite constant attempts at interference from corporate and government sources, Sarah's team completed the most comprehensive study of Arctic climate change ever conducted. They collected data from locations that had never been accessible to researchers before, using techniques that had never been applied to climate research on such a large scale. The final report, published simultaneously in 12 languages and distributed through news organizations around the world, painted a picture of climate change that was more urgent and more catastrophic than anything previously imagined. But it also provided detailed recommendations for emergency actions that could slow the collapse of the ice sheet and buy time for global adaptation efforts. More importantly, the report established new standards for scientific transparency and data protection that made it virtually impossible for future climate research to be suppressed by political or corporate interests. The techniques Sarah had developed for real-time data transmission, international legal protection, and public communication became the model for climate research organizations around the world. The Greenland Truth Mission concluded on March 14th, exactly 1 year after it began. Sarah Chen returned from the Arctic as one of the most influential figures in climate science, leading an organization that had fundamentally changed how environmental research was conducted and protected. The quiet university researcher who had walked alone into the ice 2 years earlier had become something entirely new. A warrior scientist who had weaponized research in the service of truth. But the personal cost of this transformation was enormous. Sarah's relationships with former colleagues were destroyed by the aggressive tactics she had used to protect her research. Her reputation in traditional academic circles was permanently damaged by her willingness to use legal and political pressure against fellow scientists. The woman who returned from the mission was isolated, feared, and respected in equal measure. Years later, when historians analyzed the turning point in global climate action, they would trace it back to a single decision made by a desperate researcher standing outside a burning Arctic research station. The woman who chose to walk alone into the ice didn't just save climate data that night. She began a transformation that would change how scientific truth was discovered, protected, and shared with the world. Dr. Sarah Chen never returned to university teaching or traditional academic research.
The Climate Truth Foundation grew into one of the most powerful environmental organizations in the world, conducting research in locations where governments and corporations had previously been able to suppress scientific findings. Sarah remained its director until her death 30 years later, a controversial figure who had sacrificed her personal relationships and professional reputation to ensure that future generations would have access to the truth about climate change.
The Arctic fortress she built in Greenland still operates today, now staffed by scientists from around the world, who continue the work of collecting and protecting climate data from those who would suppress it. Every researcher who works there knows the story of the woman who walked alone into the ice and returned leading the most ruthless mission in the history of climate science. They know that scientific truth is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the fight requires a kind of ruthlessness that traditional academics cannot imagine or understand. The ice that nearly killed Sarah Chen ultimately made her stronger, transforming her from a failed university researcher into one of the most important scientific figures of her generation. Her story remains a testament to the power of individual determination and the lengths to which some people will go to protect truth from those who would hide it for political or financial gain.